And welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, The Return of Brian Bales, which always feels like a Star Wars title. And we have a new series that we're kicking off this Sunday, and so we're kicking off here on the Faith Forward podcast as well. If you were with us over the last several weeks, we were working through the book of Colossians, and not just acknowledging the reality that Jesus is greater objectively and should be greater in our life, but how do we practically engage with the God who is, in fact, greater and at the center of all things?
Yeah.
And then last Sunday, Mike Haynes joined me as we talked about how to reach the next generation. And I really hope you caught both that Sunday message and the podcast episode, because there was some really good stuff in there. Today, we turn the page to a new series as we find ourselves in the church season of Lent, approaching Easter Sunday. We're going to spend the next 4 weeks leading ourselves to Easter Sunday, but specifically around this notion that whether we acknowledge it or not, and hopefully we do, we all have some expectations, not only of who God is, but because of who we expect him to be, what we expect him to do. And so what we're going to do over these next 4 weeks is redefine some of the expectations that we have of God, and maybe along the way, redefine some of the expectations that we recognize God has for us. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how you're kicking things off this Sunday, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, well, maybe the first thing we'll need to redefine is when you listen to this message on Sunday, I'm talking about historically what's known as Palm Sunday, which is usually the Sunday before Easter, and you're like, well, that's a little early. Well, one of the things that we're doing in this series is we're walking through what is known as Holy Week and different events in that week. And what we're saying over and over again in this series is that Jesus doesn't always do things the way that we expect. And one of the things that I've learned in my life that someone said to me, I don't remember where it was it happened, but certainly applies, is that oftentimes we don't realize we have expectations, especially if they're the wrong expectations of a moment, until they're not met. Monday of last week was the 24th anniversary. Kathy and I have been married. And this is a true statement. I'm not being tongue-in-cheek. If you ask my wife, how long we've been married, she'd say 24 years. If you said, how long have been happily married, she'd say 22. And the reason is a lot of those first 2 years were really about us unpacking wrong expectations that we had brought into marriage. And in fact, one of the things I said on Sunday is if you would have observed us, and really the things that were going on and could see behind the scenes, you might have thought that we didn't even prepare for it. You really would, based upon the amount of struggles and challenges that we had. But we had spent all kinds of time preparing for it. The rub is when we got together, there were some things that could only be revealed together.
Yeah.
They couldn't be revealed separately. And there are some things in our life that can only be revealed when Jesus bumps up against them, and it doesn't necessarily look like we think it should look like. And one of the things I'm bringing out in this series is that when our expectations are not met, in life we normally have two choices: double down on the expectations we have or redefine them. Now, in my relationship with my wife, I think for many, many months, in my second year, I was doubling down on them because I didn't even begin to understand that they should be redefined. And that only created more and more problems. And in life, I would tell you this, that there are times that we should double down on our expectations, and there are times that we should redefine them. But when we talk about the singular relationship that we have with Jesus, our Savior, when he doesn't meet our expectations, there's really only one good choice. There's only one person that's off in that, and it's us. But the truth is, oftentimes, knowingly and unknowingly, we try to double down. We try to fight against this because it's not what we want or not what we think, but rather we should redefine them. And frankly, I don't know that there's any particular section of Scripture, at least that I could think of at this time, that more illustrates that fact than Palm Sunday. Because one of the things when we get into this series this week is that we understood that they recognized Jesus as Messiah. They even celebrated him as king. But when he did not do what they expected, they doubled down on what they expected and they turned against him. But don't miss that they recognized him as Messiah, recognized him as king, but when things didn't line up, they had a choice. Many people chose to redefine their expectations. A whole lot of them, the people who said, "Save me, Hosanna, Hosanna," were most likely in the crowd that some days later were saying, "Crucify him." So for us, we have to examine our own life, understand that the human condition is the human condition.
Yeah.
While we often look at people in Scripture and go, "I can't believe they did that," the truth is they're just like us, and we're just like them. And so for us, the question is, what expectations in our life have we rubbed up against that instead of doubling down on, that we may not be aware of? So we're actively asking Jesus, God, what have I been doubling down on? What needs to be redefined? And so that is the whole of this series, but also specifically beginning to be illustrated through what happened on Palm Sunday when we took a look at Mark chapter 11.
Yeah. I feel like this is going to be a really helpful series, which, I mean, that's the hope for all of our series.
Yeah.
But because, like you said about your first 2 years with you and Kathy, you don't realize you have unrealistic or unreasonable expectations until they're exposed. Because prior to that point, and like you said, sometimes even in the midst of it, as I'm doubling down because they feel so reasonable.
Right, yeah.
And so one of the things that I think we're going to find, if we're willing to allow God to do some excavation in us over these 4 weeks, is we're going to expose some places where I never even realized this is what I thought, or this is what I thought about God, or this is what I thought God thought about me, or how I was supposed to live. And one of the challenges is, again, we often don't realize we have them. And so the people welcoming Jesus on Palm Sunday, if you would have asked them, what expectation do you have of the Messiah? They probably would have said something very, very close to what was actually true. Well, we believe that the Messiah has come to save us. We believe the Messiah has come to rescue us. We believe that the Messiah has come to overthrow the powers of the earth and restore the kingdom of God. But the way that we think he's going to do that, without acknowledging it, had gotten a little distorted.
Yeah, and we might get into this later on in the talk or in the series, but as you were just talking, one of the things that it struck me is that in many ways they weren't wrong in what he would do. They were wrong in the timing of it. And I think that's a very real thing in our life sometimes, that we have certain aspects about Jesus correct. Our challenge is it's just not happening in the timing that we have. And then we begin to paint a picture. We begin to do that. I know, like in Kathy and I's marriage, there were just some things that still I would say that I prefer. But there's a difference between saying I prefer this and this would be nice versus saying this is wrong and I need to double down on it.
Right.
And truthfully, when my relationship with Jesus, if I'm honest, from my limited perspective as a human who can't see the time from the beginning to end, who can't see everything that's happening in the world, I got things I prefer. That's not wrong. I mean, if you think about it, Jesus even went on the cross and said, "My God, if it, not in the upper room, not at the cross, in the Garden of Gethsemane," that's what I want to say. He said, "If it's your will." I mean, he is giving a preference. So the challenge here sometimes isn't even like that we have preferences. It's when we determine the goodness of Jesus, when we determine the goodness of God, when we make value judgments upon the character of who our Father is, who our Savior Jesus is, based upon wrong expectations, then there'll be a problem.
Yeah. And so we're going to get to this one real early in the episode this time. Ask God. Because these are really hard to self-identify because they seem so reasonable, they seem so rational, they seem so plausible, and they've probably been there for a while. Yeah,
and when we're thinking, even before we dive in farther, like, ask God what, right? That's the next question. One of the questions I wrote, so very diagnostic for Faith Forward, is most of the time we can recognize we have a feeling, but we may not recognize why we have that feeling. We may not recognize even accurately why we have that feeling. I know that there are things that, Kathy and I would have thought I had this feeling because of this, because I just felt she was doing this. But no, it was really in me. And so maybe as you go to God and you can recognize whatever it might be, that feeling that you have in this moment, go and ask God specifically with this question, why do I have this feeling?
Yep.
And be open to actually hear and listen. And you might be surprised because his answers oftentimes are much more deep, much more reforming, much more helpful than just, because this other person's wrong.
Right. Yeah. So again, diagnostic. We're just going to dive into the practical today because that's really what this is all about. This isn't talking about the possibility that it may exist or where we find biblically that people did have. This is about you and Jesus and the restoration of that relationship in places where it's been damaged, where it's felt like it's been broken, where it feels like there's some mistrust. Moving into those places rather than those just being the things that we don't talk about at Thanksgiving dinner and we just focus on the things that are good.
Yeah.
We have to have some of these conversations at some point. And so digging into what expectations do I have about Jesus that need to be redefined, here's your first diagnostic question. Where does it feel like Jesus hasn't been doing what he's supposed to do? And I hope you can hear the air quotes there.
Yeah.
Where does it feel like Jesus hasn't been or isn't doing what he's supposed to do? And I want to start by saying these are places where more than likely you are justifiably upset because things haven't been going in a way that we would recognize is good.
Mm-hmm.
And so recognize, you've got a wayward child and you feel like, but Jesus, I did what I was supposed to do. I raised up a child in the way that they should go so that when they're older, they won't depart from it. Right. And man, have they been doing some departing. Mm-hmm. And so what gives, God? I did my part. You're not doing yours. There was something in my own life a couple years back where it felt like God had very clearly called my wife out of one profession and into another, and it had felt like it was accompanied by the promise of, this is going to be really good. In fact, this is going to take you to a place that's better than where you are now. And I was like, cool, I am on board for better because where we are is pretty great. And about a year passed in that new thing, and I hadn't even realized it, but I'd started to get a little cranky with God because to the best of my ability to tell, things had not been getting better than they were before. In fact, things were getting worse than they had been before. And I was cranky with God. God, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. Yeah. Things are supposed to be better. You have physical ailments, sickness, disease, whatever. God, where are you? Mm-hmm. This isn't supposed to be happening. Look at the things I've done. I've been praying. I've been faithful. God, why aren't you doing what you're supposed to be doing? And many of us are uncomfortable having conversations with God in those places, either because we've worn ourselves out in those places and felt like nothing happened, or because we feel like we're not supposed to talk to God that way, or we're going to get smote, whatever. And we're going to get to this in a second. There are some things about God that we assume and expect that then influence the way that we interact with him. But the starting point is simply this. Do a quick inventory of your life and ask yourself the question, where does it feel like God's not showing up in the way that he's supposed to?
Yeah, the way I just thought through that question was, where's your pain point?
Yep.
And what we're going to get to in just a second, just alluded to, is that we often have an expectation around how Jesus should act in relation to our perceived or real pain. And that's often what I would like to say the catalyst for when those expectations need to be redefined. And I know that seems obvious, but again, going back to that, we often don't realize we have expectations that are wrong until they're unmet. Said another way, we often don't realize that we think something's supposed to work a particular way until it doesn't, and we have pain. C.S. Lewis, pain is God's megaphone. That he uses to amplify himself. I'm not saying the quote exactly right, to a sleeping in an unknowing world. It's what arouses us to deal with some of these things. And so maybe at the very beginning, your relationship with pain is something. Like, I don't ever wake up any morning, don't get me wrong. I feel somewhat got the yips even talking about it on a podcast because I'm not inviting pain in my life. I don't want it, right? But also, especially in the Western world, and I think I've shared this with you on a podcast before, John, or in one of our conversations, I can't remember. There's so much about our Western experience that defines goodness of God through comfort. a friend of mine who spent 2 years in a former Soviet bloc country. It was really interesting. He talked about how the believers that he met, they looked at the blessing of God based upon how much pain they were having. More pain meant better. Both of them were problematic because they were allowing their culture experiences to dictate who they believed Jesus was. But that is one thing I think, especially for the vast majority of people who are ever going to listen to these words that we're talking about, look for the pain point. And if you were, what's the caricature? I think, out loud in mouth, well, what is he? There's an accurate assessment of Jesus that says he is our great physician. But that means the physician is the best one to know how to deal with it. Yeah. We like to be our own physicians. We've WebMD'd our spiritual life, and we've determined it's this, and the way to solve it is we go to the God of the universe who's created us mind, body, and soul, right? And just created us in such a way that we think, oh, this is how you fix it. And then when he doesn't, what comes out of our mouth? What are those sort of things? Yeah. And again, when we talk about what comes out of our mouth, John, and I'm trying not to get too wrapped around this, I don't want any of us to misunderstand too far on the other end that things shouldn't come out of our mouth, right? Because confession is at the core of understanding this is what I believe, whether it's true or not. It's a starting point. It isn't saying what I believe is correct. Right. We're talking about looking at confession when it comes to God. When we confess something about God, we're confessing the truth about who he is. When we confess something about what we think about God, it's still, this is what we believe to be true. So this isn't saying, pay attention to what's coming out of your mouth and say, don't let anything come out of your mouth. Right. It is saying when those things come out of your mouth, it reveals what we believe. Out of the mouth flows the heart. Right? That's what Scripture says in the Message type version of it. And that's, what have you said? What have you thought? Those things that when you're just by yourself and only Jesus can hear, you don't have to be a journaler. Right. We can know. Like if your conversation looks like this more often than not, when you say, where are you? There's nothing wrong with that. Right. But if you say, where are you as an implication that God isn't there, it's different from where are you as a question of information. God, you say you're here. I just don't see you. So I need you to reveal yourself for me because I'm struggling. Yep. Both are questions, but they have different things.
Yeah. And again, that is a really helpful place to go because there are things that if we keep them inside seem totally logical, totally rational. And when you hear yourself say it out loud, there's sometimes a moment of, oh, wow. I didn't realize really that was in there. Yeah, I didn't realize that was in there. Yeah. And so there's an invitation here to say some things out loud, to open up sort of a free-flowing stream of consciousness conversation with yourself and God. God, what do I think you're like? And you may be surprised at some of the things that come out. I mean, I've sat with any number of people, both on the receiving end of this and on the listening end of this, and heard things like you just said, he's not there. Yeah. I understand theologically that's not true. My theology is not helping right now because my practical experience feels like he's not there. Or he's there, but he doesn't care. Or he's there and he cares, but he can't do anything about it. Yep. Right. You have to make space for, as you believe, as you think in your heart, so are you. Proverbs. Because it's having an effect on your relationship with God. And you may be engaging in a relationship with God that's based on a caricature, that's based on a distorted impression of the truth, that if God really isn't there when it comes to me, why would I spend time praying? Why would I spend time reading what he's already said? Yeah. Why would I do any of those things if he's not really there? If he doesn't really care, why would I do X, Y, and Z, right? If God is so busy with the rest of the world, or you know what, like you said, those people in the Soviet bloc, God is a God of pain. Yeah. That's first and foremost who he is. First, he's a God of pain, and then maybe he's a God of love. But he's mostly a God of pain. And so I'm just supposed to, some version of suck it up, buttercup, embrace the pain, thank him for the pain because that's what he gives first.
Yeah.
Right? There are things that we believe about God way down deep that don't often make it up to the light of day. Another version would be, God is the one who's supposed to keep me healthy, wealthy, and wise. And if that's not happening, then I'm doing something wrong. I'm falling short. I'm not living up to expectations because what's supposed to be happening is healthy, wealthy, and wise. Mm-hmm. And again, we have to let some of those things see the light of day and reach the surface and realize this is how I'm engaging with the God of the universe, as if this is what's true and this is what should be expected.
And when those come out, Jon, one of the things that you noted here that I thought was just, it's so profound, is when they come out, however they come out, we hear them, we say them some else, we write them down, and we look at them, it will paint a picture, one way or the other, of who we really think is king and who we really think is the servant. And it's so interesting, Jon. It is one of those things where I go back to those first several years of marriage with Kathy, still true in lots of times as well. Like when those things come out of our mouth, I'm like, oh, man, that seemed really, I'll just use words for me, not for you, sane inside of my head.
Yep.
Right? But when that come out and I hear myself saying that, that's crazy town. And I'm not in any way, shape, or form making fun of anyone with legitimate mental illness when I say that. There's just some thoughts that once you get out, like, hold on a second. I have put myself on the throne of the universe. I am acting in such a way that I feel I know what's best all the time. Now, don't get me wrong. I have a plan for my life. But am I open about, I won't know what's best all the time. Am I open about my position? And I think even some of us, though, it might reveal when we talk about this king versus servant language, it might even reveal some other things that we misunderstand because many of us don't think about king in a positive way. Yeah. We think dictator, but that isn't the caricature at all that's accurate of who God is, who Jesus is. There's in Revelation, he's going to show up riding, and on his leg is going to be written King of Kings and Lord of Lords. When it says King of Kings, the analogy that it's also telling us is that we have experience with other kings. We have experience with other lords, but they're not correct and they're not right. And so maybe even for us, a lot of our expectations that we bring into this scenario around God and around Jesus are brought because of our experiences in other ways. I go back again. I tell people all the time, when you step into marriage, if I'm doing premarital, knowingly or unknowingly, you bring expectations that are based upon what you experienced. Even if your expectations are knowingly, I don't want to be like the family that I had from. That doesn't mean you know what you need to be like. And it's different to work from a place of, I don't want to be some way than I want to be some way. We all carry that. And I think when we think about King of Kings and Lord of Lords, we're going to look at our experience and we're going to like, can I trust him to be king? Well, yeah, he is king, just like Jesus is greater. It's about conforming ourselves in that way, which in some ways, Jon, then that sort of, brings us to, as I tried to land the plane, I don't know if I landed it well yet. We're recording this on Thursday. We'll see again, as always, as we talk about some of the things that we need to reconsider around our expectations with Jesus and why he's here.
I really like the way that you phrase that. Reconsider some of our expectations around Jesus and why he's here.
Yeah.
Because, I don't know, there was something about and you've said this any number of times, you get to the Easter season and it's like, man, we've said all this stuff before. I've read all this stuff before, but there was just something that jumped out of your notes this time with the story in Mark about, the disciples asking Jesus, or Jesus sending the disciples ahead and saying, go into that village, and when you do, you're going to see a donkey that has never been ridden, and I want you to bring it here, and if anybody asks, just say, the Lord needs it, and we'll return it soon. And you said something in your notes about the king needs this. Mm-hmm. And what's our response to that? And it was just a really convicting moment for me in the midst of the last couple of weeks of how often is my response to the king, Your Majesty, this is what I need, and this is what you should be doing. I'm dictating to the government, which is honestly a pretty comfortable place in the 21st century America, dictating to the government what should be done rather than with a benevolent monarch, the King of Kings, coming to him and not coming groveling because he's my dad, but coming to him and recognizing he is the King of Kings and allowing the question to be asked, what does the king need? Or allowing the king to say into my life, the king needs this.
Right.
Because he has the right, because he's the king. And that has been one of the great shifts that's taken place very slowly over the course of my life, is recognizing just how often I approach Jesus, I approach the God of the universe as if I'm the one in charge. And we were just talking about this in the Wednesday night class that we teach on learning to recognize God's voice and follow it. How much of my prayer time is, or how much of my, my devotional time is, I read the Bible to try to better understand who God is and what's true. And then I have my prayer list for other people, or my prayer list of just things going on in my own life where I really need God to show up. And so often the focus of my prayers, our prayers, many people's prayers I know, is, God, here are the things that I would like you to do. Here are the ways in which I would like you to do them. Here is the timing in which I would like for that to happen. I love you, amen.
Yeah.
And without realizing it, come back to our orienting question, what expectations do I have that need to be redefined? Apparently, a large part of my expectation is I am well within my rights to have the majority of my relationship with God be focused on, God, here's what I want and what I want you to do for me. And before I say any other words, I want to say this. There's some of that's not wrong. There's any number of places in the scriptures where God himself invites us to ask, to bring our cares and worries, to bring our concerns, to bring our petitions, to bring our desires. So don't hear me creating a new caricature. God doesn't care about anything that you want. You shouldn't be bothering him with it. That's not the point. But pay attention to the primary ways in which you engage with God. And if the primary ways in which you engage with God are telling the king what you need, and very little, if any, time is spent allowing the king to tell you what the king needs, we have some expectations that need to be redefined.
One of the things that I talk about significantly whenever I speak, and I know that you're deeply passionate about this as well, Jon, is context. And there's so much about this Mark 11 passage that removed 2,000 years from both an idea about how we do our government, how we view certain things, we miss. And I want to talk about this idea of the context of ownership. When Jesus was telling his disciples to go and do this, he was giving allusions in that the reader himself would grasp in that context that we don't. He was giving the illusion that he had authority of a king. So it's really interesting, even as we talk about this, Jon, we use terms like my rights or my this.
Yeah. That
is actually not a contextually accurate statement of how a typical person would think that day. All rights that they had were submission underneath, or subsidized, or subordinate. That's the word I'm looking for. Subordinate under the king. You belong to the king. That wasn't that person's donkey. It was the king's. If he asked for it, that wasn't a person. And while that goes against so much of it, but I want us to think about this scripturally. Scripture in the book of Romans says this, is that we are either slaves to sin or slaves to righteousness. We don't belong to anyone. We don't belong to ourselves. We either belong to sin or we belong to the good king. And I think that's where the rub pain comes in. I start asserting what I believe to be my rights. Now, it doesn't mean that the benevolent king doesn't care, but I put myself in a position. Now, a Roman citizen, if you're a Roman citizen, they had certain rights that were contractually given to them. Yeah. But note, those contractual things that were given to them were by fiat of the king, We have contractual rights. We have those as sons and daughters of God. So I don't want anyone to hear again, go to the other side like, oh, God doesn't care. I'm just here to what he does. But those all come from there. Yeah. And I think a lot of the tension comes when we begin to think about ourselves in positions differently. And so when I talked about the mission of Jesus, I mean, it is, to me, the clearest place in Scripture. Jesus himself answers this question in John chapter 10. Why did I come here?
Yeah.
Like he answers it directly.
Yep.
I came that you can have life and life to the full. I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. There's an allusion there to the gospel in so many ways, both gospel for where we'll spend eternity and gospel for the transformation of our life right now. However, the challenge is we begin to define what life and life to the full is. And one of the easy ways it was happening there is they saw the oppressions of the Romans, that they had no rights, and that the Roman emperor was abusing them like crazy. And now they saw a good king, and they said, well, this king is going to give me all of this back.
Yep.
And so without even trying, this is what they thought, that Jesus came to overthrow their problems. And the first thing I think we need to redefine in our life is that Jesus did not come to overthrow our problems. Jesus came to give life and life to the full that may or may not overthrow our problems. But when we begin to define who Jesus is, when we define who his goodness is, we begin to superimpose our expectation of how our life is on how he should act, and then he doesn't. Like, he didn't overthrow the Romans. We know that. Well, because he understood that he had to first be, not the Lion of the tribe of Judah, but the Lamb who gave his life. He had to be the suffering servant before he could be the conquering king to make those things. But it completely thrown them off. And I think it throws me off lots of times. And I don't get to define the goodness of Jesus solely through how my problems are or are not resolved. And you found the best quote in the world.
Take it.
No. You get the quote. But I will say this. If you know this about our podcast or not, that there are two things that seem to be true when it's a really, really great quote. If we don't know where that quote comes from, the first thing that seems to be true, we will say it probably came from C.S. Lewis. If we know it did not come from C.S. Lewis, but we're not sure who it came from, the second person is probably in some ways, to me, a modern-day C.S. Lewis or some of the wisdom, and it's Tim Keller. Tim Keller, you found this. I still don't know if I'm going to use it on Sunday. It was so good, but I give it to you.
Yeah, Tim Keller said, we would never imagine that getting our heart's deepest desires might be the worst thing that can ever happen to us.
Mm-hmm.
And this is our place of tension. If we expect that Jesus came to overthrow our problems, we miss out on all the places where Jesus very clearly says, that's not what I came to do. I came to give you life. I'm going to send you out as sheep among wolves. That's going to create problems, not resolve them. Consider it joy when you're persecuted for being my followers. I'm not actually going to solve your problems. I'm going to send you into problems. There's something deeper. There's something greater. There's something bigger going on here without swinging in the other direction of God is the God who brings me pain.
Mm-hmm.
There is an other than reality. It's either A or B, or it's C, all of the above, or it's D, none of the above. And we're a whole lot closer to D here than we are to C, in that there's just an other way that God sees these things happening. But if our expectation, if our lens, if our framework, our practical framework, not our theology, but if our practical framework is Jesus is supposed to overthrow my problems and give me the abundant life that I want, we are going to be radically disappointed. And we are going to live a life radically disconnected from the God who wants to be connected, because we will misunderstand the nature of the connection.
It's the genie in the bottle problem. Like, phenomenal cosmic power, itty bitty living space for those who, hear that head, like that he has all this power, but he's actually a slave to do what he's been told. That is not the king. That is not the God of the universe. And I just, again, I want to say this. It's not that Jesus doesn't care about our problems, but he cares about giving us life more. And the older that my kids get, the more I understand this towards me. I just do. as they face more complicated and more challenging problems as they grow old. I can't even put into words how many times I'm like, I want to solve this for them, but that doesn't give them life.
Yeah.
It doesn't give them life. Now, it doesn't mean I'm not there and protecting the midst, and it doesn't mean in the midst of your problems that God isn't there and protecting you. It just means his goal is life, not to solve our problems. Sometimes life solves our problems.
Yep.
Sometimes it doesn't. But when we think solving problems is the number one thing he's there to do to give us life, then our expectations are going to line up. And then that's when we've either got to redefine them, or for some of us, we keep doubling down. Like, God, you haven't done what I want when you want.
Yep.
So I'm going to turn from Hosanna to crucify him.
Yeah.
Right? And it may not have taken 5 days. Maybe it's taken much longer than that. But I don't think we can miss that. The people there, we look and go, I can't believe they did that so fast. Well, we don't know what it's like to live under Roman rule.
Yeah.
But we do know what it's like to live under the tyranny of the brokenness of this world, and how easy it is for us to turn in that way. Yeah. So it's an invitation to ask, what are we thinking about Jesus and his goal? Because he came to give life and life to the full.
Yeah. And, you said maybe it wouldn't take 5 days. The more I've come to learn myself, the more I've come to recognize I think I could have been part of that crowd without too much trouble because of the sheer level of betrayal that they felt after how many centuries of waiting for a Messiah who, as far as they could understand from the very words that God had spoken, and the words that we use at Christmas all the time, the government will rest on his shoulders, right? How much they must have felt like they'd been lied to. Just like when Jesus told the disciples, now that you understand I'm the Messiah, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to go die. And Peter takes him aside. He's like, that can't be the plan.
And it's one of the things that I tried to bring out on Sunday is that when we close ourselves off to what Jesus is saying and we think we completely follow it, we will miss his clues. Yeah. Jesus contextually, many times in this passage, tells the people who he was and what he was there to do. That's why I made some points on Sunday that he came in riding on a donkey. We don't think anything about that. Right. But in that culture, they knew victory parades, and they knew the difference between riding a horse and riding a donkey. But they so desperately, even maybe from the goodness of their desires, wanted to see what they wanted to see. Yep. And the question is, am I seeing what Jesus is saying, or am I just so desperately doubling down, no, it has to be this way? Yeah. And then here's what happens. You ready? We hold Jesus responsible for something he never said he would do. Mm-hmm. There's so many times in our life we're like, Jesus, you didn't do this, you didn't solve this problem. And it's not that he doesn't care. He does. But he said, I didn't come to solve your problems. I came to give you life. Yeah. And I think that's, for me, one of the fundamentally biggest things I've had to redefine. Yeah. Just because pain tends to be the point where it brings up the expectations, and then to understand that, I've viewed pain and problem solving as bringing me life when it's gone. Yeah. Maybe not. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things we have to realize is Jesus came to give life, not overthrow our problems, because as Keller said, if Jesus would just give us everything we wanted, that might be the worst thing that could ever happen to us, because it would keep the problem, because I'm going to structure this poorly on purpose. Our problem isn't the problems around us. Our problem is the problems inside of us. And our core problems are our fierce desire for independence, not just civically, but spiritually. I really don't want to be controlled by God. I don't want to submit to the king when all is said and done. I want to be self-sufficient. I don't want to be reliant on the king either. I want to be able to get what I want, when I want, how I want. And if he'll give me that, great, less work for me. But if he won't, then get out of the way, because I know what I need. Yeah. And that so reveals our idolatry. Right? And it's again, I can't believe those people that would turn on him in 5 days. I can't believe those people in the Old Testament that would go back to making all these other idols. Yes, I can. Yes, I can believe it, because we do it. Yeah. We still hedge our bets with, well, I know Jesus is the answer, but I'm also going to pad the stats a little bit with this, that, and the other thing to make sure I still get what I want. Mm-hmm. Those are our problems. And if Jesus got rid of all the surrounding problems, we would just continue to live out of the actual problems.
Yeah.
And so I'm inverting your second and third points from Sunday.
I like what you did here. I looked at it. I was like, I like that.
Thanks. The last point you made was that Jesus' mission should always determine our mission. And you said this, we don't like sacrifice, understatement of the millennium.
Mm-hmm.
We don't like sacrifice, and so we often examine the goodness of our life exclusively through how much or how little we need to sacrifice. It's the idolatry of comfort. It's the idolatry of self-sufficiency. It's the idolatry of independence. It's the idolatry of my way. And yet we pointed out the reality that sacrifice has a purpose when the king says, the king needs this.
Yeah.
When the king says the king needs this, it's for our good and his glory. And yet we don't like sacrifice. And we don't like allowing the king to take our metaphorical donkeys. We don't like the king to take away the things that feel like ours, and we don't like it when the king doesn't give us the things that we feel like should be ours. And if we don't allow the king's mission to come first, we're going to have problems.
And I think, John, going back to, why am I feeling the way that I feel?
Yeah.
When I begin to bring that out, it shows me certain things about what I think about God.
Yep.
In that when he asked me to give up my metaphorical donkey, and I kick and I scream, and I mentioned in the sermon that some of the best things that have ever happened to me came through sacrifice. I didn't put this in an illustration. My wife would be fine with me sharing this story. I don't know that I've publicly shared this before. My wife and I met. I'm so glad. God's just great. After I'd already been engaged. And broke up, and it wasn't, I didn't initiate it. The other person did. Part of it was, in my life, going back and look at it, God was on the edge of calling me into what I do now. I didn't always do this. And there was a belief in me that if I did that, and my stronghold around money and finances, I would never be okay. So I was like, okay, God, great. And so I have 100% confidence. He said, okay, give up this person. And I wouldn't have, because I was not going to do ministry. So he found another way. It was by far, and this isn't about the quality of that other human being at all. This is about what God was doing in my life, the best thing that happened to me to get me there. But at the time, I looked at that as like, God, this is my metaphorical donkey, and you're going to hurt me. No. Anything that he asks for, he is asking for the good of the kingdom that at some level may take some sacrifice from you. Yeah. And you may not ever see it. The example I'm giving is something that I get a chance to see now, 30 years later, that I didn't see at the time. But whether you see it 3 years, 3 months, 3 days, 30 years later, or never this side of eternity, he doesn't ask us to do things to hurt us. It's for his good, our good, and his glory. Yeah. And so again, maybe that's a weird illustration, maybe it's not, but I think, looking back, I can say, wow, that was one of the hardest moments of my life at that time. Yep. But man, holy cow, thank you. That, in this case, he took the donkey, because I was like, no, thank you, even though the Lord has need of it.
Yeah.
By the way, this could seem like a bad analogy. I seem to make someone out to be that I used to date as a donkey. If that came across that way, please forgive me. That wasn't the idea.
Right. We're talking about any number of good things as being donkeys here that
metaphorical
the king
donkeys.
has need of.
Yeah.
And so the second point that you made that I'm now bringing up at the end is Jesus' mission primarily is to teach us how to live by eliminating the substitutes.
Yeah.
It's the reality of when people came to Jesus and either through entrapment or genuineness said, what's the greatest commandment? And he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And we now rattle that off so fast sometimes that we miss the significance of that was the thing.
Yeah.
That's the thing. That's the one thing. I came so that you could be restored and reconnected and learn to submit to a good king and a good father and love him with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, because that's how he loves you. That's the mission. And so everything that Jesus does is aimed at, let's get rid of anything that's not that, because anything that's not that is in the way of you having the life to the full I want you to have. It's not a life to the less. It's not a life to the minimal. It's not a life purely of sacrifice. It's not a life of all of your comforts. It's life to the full with the best King and Father that could ever exist, that we get to know and love with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, because that's how we are loved. And so that's the place of invitation as we close this, is what are the substitutes that are in the way of me experiencing that? Think of the things right now that you believe will give you life if Jesus just fixes them in the way that you desire. And recognize that many of those are probably substitutes. They're the donkeys that the king either needs to do something with and then give back to you, because that's the kicker in the Mark 11 section. What Jesus says to his disciples is, go get this donkey, and if anyone asks, what are you doing? Just say, the Lord needs it, and will return it soon. This isn't just the God who takes away all the good things so you never have fun again. This is the God who in many ways takes things that are needed and then brings about a restoration. And so just make space for that. What are the substitutes that the king needs to address?
Before we close, I want to go back to something that Jon just reminded me of. At the beginning, I talked about that sometimes we feel frustrated around his timing. And you might be listening to this. You may be watching on YouTube or however you get this podcast or video cast. And you think this, but yeah, I have given it up. And God said he'd return it soon, and he hasn't. He is faithful. Like our soon, even in those languages, I mean, we don't know what soon meant. We know that he returned it because he's faithful and true. Maybe it was that afternoon. Maybe it was a week. We have no idea who even returned it. Like, none of that we know, but we know because of who Jesus is and faithful, it got returned. And so if you're in the moment like, all right, well, I'm struggling with this because my expectations of soon have been different than his. Know that you're not alone, but know that he's there with you. And his desire in this is to help you understand what it means to know him at a deeper level. I'm just going to leave that there because it just struck me again. I think a lot of times it's about timing, because I even looked at that and I go like, oh, well, when soon?
Yeah.
When soon?
All times are soon.
Yeah.
And that means that at some point for this relationship to work, we have to invite him into the pain, into those places of disappointment, of confusion, of I thought the timing was supposed to be this, or I thought the outcome was supposed to be this. My wife, Brooke, and I love, we're talking about this a couple of days ago.
We haven't given her a Brooke shout out today.
Yeah. We were talking about this just a couple of days ago. And one of the things that came to mind was why we don't want to invite him in is because it often feels like, well, you're the one that either caused the hurt in the first place, which isn't necessarily true, or you allowed the hurt in the first place, or you didn't stop the hurt. And I couldn't remember where it was in the scriptures. I knew it was there someplace, so I had to go find it. But it was Psalm 34, verse 18. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. And what Brooke and I were talking about was the reality that God is close to the brokenhearted is really interesting when you think about just how much the brokenhearted don't usually want God to be close. Because you did it, you allowed it, you didn't stop it. Don't come close. Get away from me. And the invitation is, he's near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit, but that requires a willingness to allow him to be who he is, not who we've expected him to be. And Brooke said something that I just thought was really cool. She said, one of the things that so helped me over the years of the pain was I've learned to let God talk to me about whatever he wants to while I'm still mad at him and really listen. that'll make all the difference in the world in allowing the mission of the King to be fulfilled in you and around you, to allow him to come close, to heal the brokenhearted, as Jesus said he came to do, to save those who are crushed in spirit, so that we can continue to grow in our ability to love him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, recognizing that that's how he loves us, because he is a good king, and he is a good father. And there are times where what the king needs is what we need to let go of. It's going to be a good 4 weeks on redefining expectations. And so I hope that you'll stay with us. They're not an easy 4 weeks, but they are a good 4 weeks because they help us to identify and then let go of the things that stand in the way of truly loving him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. So until next time, he's Brian, I'm Jon. We'll see you later.